Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be. This is Matt Fraunhofer with Microfocus. Just letting you know we are going to be getting started here in about 2 minutes. Let some of the last minute stragglers get on here and we will get started. Thank you. All right, we got a couple more people just joining and then we'll get started here in about 2 minutes. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, good afternoon to those of you on the West Coast, the East Coast. My name is Matt Fraunhofer. I am a solutions architect with Microfocus, formerly Serena, and this is the Discovering SBM webinar series. So this webinar series is all around SBM and how to best utilize it within your environment and provide some different tips and tricks to be able to do that. Today's session is a little bit different than what we normally do. Normally, it's we try to keep it a pretty technical session and go into the tool and start showing how to do different things within the tool. Today is going to be a bit more conceptual. One of the things as a solutions architect that we frequently run into is customers ask us, hey, do you guys have an integration to, or can we integrate SBM, or frankly, any product into another product? And oftentimes the answer is maybe. And so one of the things we wanted to do is shed some light around the different things that we need to discuss and what the process we go through as solution architects to really help figure out and nail down what it is you're trying to do with that integration. And then we can come up with an answer as to how we would perform that integration. Oftentimes there's kind of hidden things that will come into play and factors that we need to consider before we design an integration. So as always, I always like to start out with a quote. Godfrey Reggio, an author, technology has become as ubiquitous as the air we breathe, so we are no longer conscious of its presence. And that's truly the spirit behind integrations. Good integrations are not meant to get in the way of providing value and get in the way of individuals working with the systems. The whole purpose behind integration is to try and simplify the end user's workflow, so that way things become transparent to them. They don't really realize what's happening or the complexity, and we kind of abstract that away through a good integration. And then Bill Gates also had this to say about using technology in business and automation in general. When we think about integration, we have to think about the efficiency aspect. There's always a process behind everything we do. And that's one of the things that if you've interacted with me directly, or if you've interacted with any of my coworkers, we're all very process focused. What is the process that the end user is going to go through? And that will help drive some of this integration discussion. If there's an inefficient process in front, any integration we do is likely not going to change that inefficiency. It's only going to potentially magnify it. But if we approach the integration conversation as, okay, we want to simplify this because it already is inefficient, we want to make it more efficient, and that's the reason for the integration, oftentimes we end up with a better process overall and better usability of the system, and still maintaining all of the different things that the business requires. So one of the first things that we want to discuss when customers ask us about integrations is really the why. Why are we doing this integration? There has to be some sort of business value to an integration. Integration for integration's sake is generally just a waste of money. And the key thing is value doesn't necessarily equal dollars. It doesn't necessarily equal money that you're going to physically be able to put your hands on. Oftentimes, integration can do that, but it doesn't necessarily have to. Value is a number of different things, and to every organization, it's different. It could be that the usability of the system is value, because more users are going to utilize that system more effectively and more efficiently. Compliance. So if I'm having to manually type in a value today, what happens if I mistype that value? Well, if I provide an integration to where I'm provided, here's a list of valid values, and that, say it's a PO from another system, I now select that, and now we have that common denominator, that tie, to be able to provide that traceability that we're looking for, instead of having that manual transcription and that chance for human error. And so all of that goes into this concept of value. Why are we doing this integration? Some common drivers for that is generally compliancy. So being compliant with audit requirements, being compliant with other divisions within the business. Usability is a big one. So just to make everybody's life easier, if users don't have an easy system to work in, generally they will find ways around that system. Whether the business realizes it or not, generally there's some sort of side process that's happening. And so by providing an integrated system together and making sure that it is usable, we're able to kind of eliminate that and really nail down, okay, here's the process that we go through to do X, Y, Z. And then efficiency. Manually typing in values and transcribing values between different systems is obviously inefficient. If we can just pass the data back and forth, you get a few benefits from that, including the efficiency factor. You also get the traceability and less chance for human error in the transcription of that. And then say I run a report and now I need to go and try and find some PO number that was mistyped, and now I have to figure out, okay, which one actually is it supposed to be? So we have to answer the why question. And then past that, we really need to become storytellers as we're going through and defining what this integration looks like. Who? So we have to answer the who question. Who is going to utilize this integration? Who is going to benefit? Who are my end users? Managers generating reports, how could they benefit from this integration? What other departments could benefit from these integrations? And think outside the box. Just because they're not necessarily in your particular scope today, that doesn't mean that they couldn't benefit from it, and you're just building a bigger case for why this integration is important to the business and what value it can provide. And interview the end users. Throughout all this, that will be the common theme, is talk to the actual users of the tool. Oftentimes, businesses say, okay, we need an integration between tool A and tool B. But if you actually talk to the end users, there's also tool C here that an integration between A and B would be great, but tool C is really the pain point for why we would need to integrate. And so having all three of those integrated together is really the key to provide business value. And then the next question is what? What are we integrating? What data are we transferring? So what data is coming across? Where is the, what actions in tool A is triggering something in tool B? And notice I'm keeping this very agnostic because these are things that apply to everything, not just SBM. SBM happens to be a very integratable tool, and so that's why oftentimes these discussions happen with SBM, but this frankly applies to any tool. What actions are you performing in your original tool that need to either trigger something in tool B or tool B to tool A? Does it need to be both directions? Do we need to have a bidirectional integration, or is it a single flow from tool A to tool B or B to A? The directionality, again, like I said, how is the data flowing? And this gets into the networking side of things as well. If I am initiating an action within my tool A and I need to push data over to tool B, I now have a requirement that I need to figure out, okay, can tool A do that out of the box? Because there may not be any sort of a venting mechanism within tool A, and so now tool B needs to actually pull tool A and figure out, okay, here's the data set, and now I need to process it. Maybe both tools don't have any capability like that. They have APIs, but they have no eventing triggers or any way to get data from out of the system automatically upon an action. And so now we need a third-party middleman to do that integration properly. We also need to consider logging. So we would also like to believe that integrations work 100% of the time with no errors. That's a great idea, and oftentimes, I would say 95% of the time, a properly designed integration works as expected. However, for that 5%, inevitably, that's going to happen. So how are we going to log those errors? And how are we going to reprocess that data through the integration? In SBM, that could take you could create an aux table to hold all those log messages for an orchestration or a mod script or any other sort of integration. It could take the form of a text file for that, a database table that we have to move over and reprocess those items at the end of the day. All sorts of those questions, and that all revolves around logging and exception handling. And again, interview your end users. The workflow here is key for what this integration actually looks like. So if my end user, for example, let's just talk about Git and SBM. So Git is a source control tool that most people are familiar with. And so we've had many customers say, okay, we use SBM for issue defect management and we want to integrate that to Git. Okay, so what are we actually integrating? Because Git is a command line tool. It doesn't have necessarily a user interface. And so are you looking for to be able to just type in a specific set of keywords and then have that automatically trigger into SBM that this code commit belongs to this particular record that's referenced? What format does that look like to my end users? And we'll go down that discussion, and little did we know, the end users are actually using a Git client to do all their work, and then some sort of IDE. And so now, instead of integrating to Git, we need to look at, okay, do we need to actually integrate to the IDE itself? Because the developers are looking for a user interface to be able to have a select from a drop-down list of defects, and then all of that work happens behind the scenes to integrate SBM and Git, instead of just typing in some sort of keyword and defect ID in the Git commit message. So there are numerous different things that we need to talk to the end users about. We need to understand their workflow and make sure that whatever integration we put in place is not going to disrupt their workflow significantly. Or if it's going to disrupt it, we need to figure out a way to make it as transparent to them as possible and acceptable to the end user. If you do not involve the end user in any of this, oftentimes this integration will either be a pain point for those users, or they're going to find a way around the integration just by typing in some random characters or something like that. They will find a way around it, and then nobody benefits from this integration. So we talk about the after what, then we go to when. So when is this integration happening? Is it being triggered on demand? So every time an action in tool A happens, then something happens in tool B or data moves over to tool B? Or is this scheduled? Is this happening on a nightly basis? Are we refreshing data so that it's historical, but it's still relatively fresh? So every night at midnight, all this data comes over from another tool into SBM or SBM to another tool. Those are all big questions. And then remember the impact on server resources. If you're doing a schedule, how many records are you synchronizing in that overnight period? Or whenever you're performing that integration, that schedule, that can all play a factor into what resources your server is going to use. And if you have a number of users utilizing the system at the same time, they might be impacted as well from a performance perspective. So that's something to always keep in mind. Luckily with SBM in particular, we can split off different components, and so we can kind of move some of that resource demand and constraint over to a different box while that scheduled process is running. But other systems out there, they don't necessarily have that capability, and so that's something you want to always look at. And then again, interview end users. If you're kind of agnostic to how the integration, when the integration actually occurs, talk to them, because your end users might tell you, well, if this data is a day old, then it's of no value to me. And so obviously now we need to look at either some sort of real-time on-demand integration, or we need to look at maybe every 5 minutes, and we need to design for delta changes instead of just bringing over a nightly sync of everything. So there's a number of different questions and things that we need to consider when we're talking about these integrations. And then the next part is where. Where is this integration actually occurring? Location. So if I have a server in Asia Pacific that I am trying to integrate with, and my SBM server or any other server is in the United States, depending on my bandwidth and my network latency, that could definitely have an impact in how quick this integration actually occurs. And if I'm trying to bring over megabytes and gigabytes of data every night, depending on that network latency and bandwidth, I may not have enough physical time in the day to do this integration, or we need to look at some sort of compression mechanism to be able to compress that data into smaller chunks and process it once it gets across. You also need to remember that's going to put a huge strain potentially on your network resources. And so if you have users in Asia Pacific that only have a 1 megabit link for whatever reason, then even if they're performing that integration, if they're not using the system, it's still taking up their bandwidth out of their office. And so they may be impacted in other ways. So again, talk to your end users. A common thing is home workers, folks that work from home. So how does that impact things? All of a sudden now, if we need to be able to associate code commits and things like that to SBM or any other sort of integration, are we talking about having SBM publicly accessible on the internet from the company and put it behind some sort of federated identity store, or are my end users always going to be on a VPN connection? So then it's just like the internal network. Are there firewalls on the VPN side that we need to consider? So all of that will play into a factor. Where are my end users located when they're wanting to use this integration? So we've talked about we've got the story that we want to integrate with, and so now what's next? How do we take that and then formulate a plan? If there's any questions, feel free to toss them out at any point during the webinar, and we'll get to them all toward the end, unless it directly relates to what we're talking about right now. But feel free to toss in any comments or questions into the questions area. So we've got our story. What's next? Technical capabilities and considerations. So now we dive into kind of the meat of the integration. How are we going to actually make this happen? We know what we want. We know when we want it. What are going to be the mechanisms we use? We need to figure out, okay, what APIs do we have able for us to be able to use? If we are looking at SBM, we have all those documented. It's publicly accessible documentation. You're able to see all those. But other systems, especially homegrown systems. Maybe it's a Lotus Notes application. I'm going to have to do some research on Lotus Notes and see what different APIs that we have. Obviously, it's got a database backend, so we could go straight to the database, but then what impact is that going to have, and is that going to be allowed by the system owner that owns Lotus Notes within my IT organization? And APIs are always safer than direct database manipulation. APIs are provided by a vendor to provide a standard structured way to perform some sort of action or trigger some sort of mechanism into their system. And so APIs are always preferred. Are they HTTP based? Are they web service based APIs? SOAP, REST based, or are they traditional? SBM, for those of you that might not know, has a C++ API. If you wanted to make a client-based service sitting on the SBM server, there is a C++ API to allow you to directly integrate with the DLLs behind SBM. So how do you want to do that integration? What is available to you? The eventing and triggering mechanisms. So if my integration use case is when I click this button or this action happens in tool A, then this needs to happen in tool B, then we need to not necessarily be concerned with tool B, but I need to know, okay, in tool A, when that action happens, how am I going to send an alert or something to tool B to tell it to do something? So is that maybe an email notification? An email could be from a specific address, might be a notification to kick off some sort of integration. Maybe you can configure an actual API call when you select a certain value from tool A into tool B. So those are the considerations you have to make, and especially when you start getting into, well, I need to integrate into client applications. So like Eclipse, or that's a common one we get asked for. That's fine, but now we need to look into, okay, what sort of APIs does Eclipse have that we need to utilize to call web services? What language do I have to write that in? Is it a scripting language? Do I have to write a Java plugin to this application? And so now I need a Java developer to do that. Or is it like SBM, where it's an orchestration that I just have to drag and drop and then set up the events and triggers within SBM to perform that at that certain point? Every system is different, and so that's definitely one of the things that you have to consider when you're talking about this. If you don't have those in your source system, so system A that's trying to trigger system B, now we have to look at, okay, does system B have the ability to go out every 5 minutes or at some particular interval and check in with system A and say, hey, do you have any changes that we need to sync or any sort of job for me to do? And so now we have to pull system A to check on those results. So does system B have that ability to do that? If not, then maybe we need to put in some sort of third party in the middle of those to be able to do that. That is a common use case for SBM, that it watches, especially now with the scheduler within SBM, watch system A and keep pulling it. And then when I see something, go off and do something in system B. Is that what we need to put in place? May be the answer, it may not be. It all depends. Communication protocols and ports. So another big one is working with your network security folks to understand what ports and what communication protocols are going to be allowed on the network to perform these integrations. Is the system that we're trying to integrate with, is it all defined with a JMS queue? And so now we have port, I think it's 671 for that. Is it all HTTP traffic? Where is the source? Who's issuing the first request out to the destination system? Because that's going to impact how the firewall rules need to be designed to allow that traffic. Is it a cloud-based system? So now we need to set up outbound even to internet protocols and open up firewalls and put SBM or whatever system may be in the DMZ to be able to support that. So you need to work with your network security folks and, again, know the capabilities of your two systems. Authentication mechanisms is becoming a big one. Do you support OpenAuth for HTTP-based integrations? Is it HTTP basic for web services, where we have to embed the username and password for a particular integration user account? Where are we going to store that? Is it going to be stored in SBM? Is it going to be stored in a database table? Is it going to be stored, heaven forbid, on a file share somewhere in a text file that we have to parse? All of those are options, and you could debate whether they're good ones or not, but they're all means to an end. But if you don't have, if System A can't support OpenAuth and System B is an OpenAuth only or an OAuth only, it only supports OAuth for integrations, then now we have to figure out another solution there. Figure out how to get System A to support OAuth and be able to form that request. So those can definitely play a factor. Do we use a third-party network security layer that now we have to add in custom headers into our HTTP traffic and embed a token? Do we have to request a token first and then embed that into all of my subsequent requests? So all of that can play a factor. And now we need to consider our business considerations. So the initial cost, who is going to perform this work? Is your organization going to perform the integration and build the integration? Are you going to hire outside consultants? If it's a Micro Focus tool, are you going to hire our professional services to do this integration? Ongoing maintenance is a big one. When System B comes out with version 5 and you upgrade, if they've changed their APIs, now my integration breaks. If it is a supported integration by the vendor, you would expect the vendor to provide that maintenance. But if you guys are building the integration yourselves, or based on a professional services contract, depending on how that's worded, that might be something that now your organization is needing to do or contract again to get that updated. So that is an ongoing consideration that needs to happen. System ownership, and this is a big one. So when we come into customers, we oftentimes have a particular system owner for, in this case, SBM, and they want to integrate with another system that has a different system owner. That other system owner they've never talked to, and sometimes they don't even know who that is within the organization. And so until we actually get everybody that's involved in a room, it's very difficult for us to be able to say what sort of integration and what level of integration are you going to be able to do. We can tell you out of the box here, according to documentation, here's the APIs that system B has, but that may not be what the system owner wants to allow you to do, or maybe they have a different strategy. One common thing is now API management software. So if you've heard of a company called MuleSoft, they provide API management software. And it kind of serves as an intermediary for APIs. So instead of integrating to directly to System B, we have to integrate to MuleSoft, and they can change the different authentication methods that you have available, or perform any sort of customizations on those APIs and abstract that away directly from the system. Okay, that's a big one. Do we have to integrate with that versus directly to the system? If so, then where do we get those API specifications? How do we get all that documentation? Who supports that API layer? Those are all things that the system ownership, you have to understand who all the players are within your organization. And audit requirements. What is any of this going to be auditable? Do you have to provide anything to auditors, whether internal or external auditors, to be able to prove that this integration is working as expected, no data manipulation is happening that isn't designed, etc. It all depends on the organization. If we're just syncing test cases between systems, it may not be a consideration. But if we're actually syncing purchase orders or purchase requisitions and prices and other things of that nature, yeah, there might be some audit considerations that have to happen. And so you have to be conscious of that and be able to design into the system a way for those auditors to get at that data. So maybe we need to log, here's the message we got from system A, and then here's what system B reflected after that message came in. We have to log that somewhere. That is now reportable. So this is not meant to be an exhaustive list by any means of the different business considerations, but see, these are some of the common ones that we've run into as we've gone into various customers to do this kind of analysis. So with that, I will pause. Any questions? If you have any, please feel free to put them into the questions area, and we will get to them as quick as we can. All right, so no questions so far. So what do we provide from Micro Focus as help for this? Where do we have resources for you? So as always, and first, I would say your solution architects and your account team. We're always ready to help with these integration discussions. Oftentimes, we've had a number of customers asking for very similar integrations between tools, and so we can provide firsthand knowledge of those other integrations that other customers have successfully completed. And if we don't have the answers, we have the R&D contacts, we have contacts with professional services, we have all the resources to help get you to folks within our organization, Micro Focus, that can help you understand what common integrations look like and help you go through this process. as always, please feel free to reach out to our solution architects or your account team, and they can point you to the appropriate solution architect for this. The professional services organization, I can't speak highly enough of. We have great folks on our professional services organization that have actually done these integrations for many different customers. I know there's a couple here that are attending this webinar, and I know that they have done some very creative integrations for various customers. So if you at least want to explore what an integration could look like, professional services between them and the solution architects and your account team, we can definitely come up with a solution. But again, you have to have some of those other answers, and we can always help you get some of those other answers from the questions that we surfaced earlier. And documentation is a big one. So we have to know what APIs are available. So within SBM, we have all those documented in terms of the REST APIs and the web services and even the C++ API. But for that destination system, we need to have that documentation as well. So if you can provide us at least versions of the software that you're wanting to integrate with. So if you want to integrate with, say, Salesforce, okay, what version of Salesforce are you on? Because APIs generally will change every version. Now, ideally, they have not changed too drastically, or they're versioning their APIs, so there's always going to be a backwards compatibility. But sometimes there are breaking changes that are made to APIs that are potentially unavoidable, and so we have to know specifically what version of the software we're integrating with, and then we always try to take into account, okay, you're on version 2, version 4 is current, here's the API in version 4, here it is in 2, let's try and design this so that way when you upgrade to 4, the integration doesn't necessarily break. Serena Central is another great source. So your peers, if you just post on Serena Central, you'll get the support organization monitoring that, as well as the solution architects, professional services, and your peers. So they can all share their expertise and what their organizations have done from an integration perspective. And then our support organization, of course, they have many years of working through integrations and any challenges that customers have faced with those, and would definitely be able to at least get you to the right folks to discuss what an integration might look like for you. So with that, any questions? Wanted to save enough time here at the end for any other questions that might come up, and even if they don't revolve around SBM, but just integrations in general. And give it another minute or two and let people ask any questions that they might have thought of. Okay, here's one about integrations within SBM. So there's a couple different ways to do integrations within SBM. You've got your client methods, where maybe you want an integration directly on the form itself, and then the system level. So what are the differences between that? At the form level, we can go out utilizing our REST grid and also JavaScript directly to be able to perform web service calls. Usually REST is the easiest, but you could do SOAP through JavaScript. A little bit more overhead there, but to go out and get, for example, zip codes. So if I need to, if I want to have a city and state on my submit form, but I also need zip, well, generally I can derive the city and state from the zip code that's entered. So instead of having my customer fill in all three values separately, I can perform some built-in validation just by having a zip code. They press a button and it goes off to a web service. There's a number of web services directly from the Postal Service available, as well as other third parties that would be able to go out and pull back. Here are the associated city and states. You choose within the REST grid, and then that data, you can use form actions to automatically take your selected row and put that into the SBM field. So that's a common one that we've seen, and that's a client-side integration. That doesn't necessarily have an impact on the workflow itself, but it makes it easier for the end user to submit items. And we also perform that validation because we're going directly to a known data source to get those city and state values. So we know how they're going to come back, and they're going to be in a specific format, etc. And we know that that zip code is valid for the city and state that was provided. On the system side, we've got the ability for orchestrations. So you can go out and perform an entire web service orchestration with either SOAP or RESTful web service calls to perform pretty much anything that you would want to do without having to write code. So the orchestration engine allows you to drag and drop different web services in a specific order, and then also your calculation steps and adding in some of your logic to where you're performing the integration and without actually having to write the code for it. And then it gets processed whenever it receives the event. And those event triggers are defined within your SBM workflow, or another system could be potentially configured to emit that a particular event, and SBM watches for that event to come into the event manager component of SBM. The other side could be mod script. So mod script can now be called from a web service, or it could be called directly from or executed directly as part of the workflow. And so you could write a mod script utilizing the Chai script language, which is very similar to C++. And we're actually going to go over performing outbound RESTful web service calls and processing JSON data in the next webinar session coming up in August. So if you want to learn more about Chai script and how to actually perform those RESTful integrations and process that data, definitely join us for that session. So those are, and then obviously we have the C++ API that I mentioned. If there are any services that you want to write on the actual SBM server to perform anything, you can access SBM in that manner as well. So with that, any other questions? Not seeing any additional ones coming in. So as always, our next sessions on 8.1, like I mentioned, we're going to be having a session about RESTful integrations with ModScript, how to perform and actually work with those within the mod scripting language. And so that'll be a very technical one, a very in-depth one to go through. We'll go through the different object types of ModScript and how to work with those. Later in August, we're going to be talking about SBM and single sign-on. So a frequent topic coming up for our customers is federating authentication. So you're probably all familiar with when you go to let's say stackoverflow.com. I believe you can sign in using your Facebook account there. That's utilizing a protocol called OpenAuth. Kind of the industry standard protocol for internal systems, at least, is SAML2. So if you use ADFS or Active Directory Federated Services, NetIQ Access Manager, it's the Micro Focus product. How do we configure and exchange the metadata for that single sign-on solution so that you get authenticated through the single source for all of your applications in your environment? So we'll go through how to configure that and get that up and running. And then the September session is going to be about generating PDFs with SBM. So one of the things that is kind of underused today is the PDF widget, the ability to take data within SBM and automatically populate a fillable PDF with that data, and then save that PDF or email it off to customers. So that one will be a pretty quick session on how to do that. But you should be receiving emails soon about registering for those events. And then, of course, the webpage there, microfocus.com/events/discovering-SBM, is the landing site. So it should get updated I think we had a slight issue this time getting it updated in time, but it should be always updated with the next session upcoming for you to register. And if you have feedback for us, please let us know. So matt.frauenhofer@microfocus.com, the product manager for SBM, Dave Easter @microfocus.com, and then also something new, I'm going to try and be on Twitter a little bit more, putting out some comments and suggestions. So if you are a Twitter user, feel free to tweet me at m_Frauenhofer and ask any questions about SBM or Micro Focus or life in general as well. So with that, I thank you for joining. Please feel free to reach out if you guys have questions and want to know more. But again, thanks for joining. Have a great day and great afternoon. Bye-bye.